The War of the Roses brought a brutal civil war to England, which had the country divided between the House of Lancaster or the House of York. Throughout this civil war, the throne and the crown of England was tossed between both houses. Eventually, the War of the Roses culminated in one of England's most notorious kings, Richard III, being slain at the Battle of Bosworth and losing to Henry Tudor. This would then mark the start of the Tudor dynasty. What is lesser known is the fate of the last Lancastrian ruler of England. Henry VI was the king twice in his life, from 1422 to 1461, and then during 1470 and 1471. Born on the 6th of December 1421 at Windsor Castle, he was only 9 months old when he succeeded his father, Henry V. He would be the youngest person to ever succeed to the English throne. Henry VI was officially crowned king in 1429, and even crowned the King of France in 1431, following his father's victories in the 100 Years' Wars. Until Henry was considered old enough, a regency council would run England. In 1445, he would marry Margaret of Anjou, and was an extremely pious man, who tended to pick the wrong advisors. Henry VI was unable to prevent power struggles in his court, and his dual reign over England and France became extremely difficult and stressful for him to maintain. Joan of Arc's successes began to weaken England's grip on France, and Normandy was lost in 1450, denting the king's reputation. In 1453, the king had a mental breakdown, and Richard, the Duke of York, was named Protector of England. After recovering in 1455, civil war broke out in England, dividing the country between the Yorkist and Lancastrian factions. This struggle for supremacy, known as the War of the Roses, saw the Duke of York pitted against Henry's Queen, who commanded the Lancastrian cause. In 1460, the Duke of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield. However, his son then took up the fight and defeated the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton, crowning himself Edward IV. Because of this, Henry VI then fled into exile, but then returned and was captured by Edward in 1461. During his capture, in 1465, Henry was paraded through London, with his feet tied to a horse, wearing a straw hat, proclaiming him to be a rebel, designed to cause great humiliation to the former monarch. However, at the turn of the decade, Henry's fortunes would change. The famous and notorious Earl of Warwick, also known as Kingmaker, switched sides, turning on the new king, Edward, and restoring Henry to the throne in 1470. At this battle, Henry VI saw a huge loss, with his only son being killed in the battle. Distraught, Henry was then imprisoned and thrown into the Tower of London once more. When the royal party arrived in London, it was reported that Henry VI was dead. Official chronicles and documents from the time state that the deposed king died in the evening of the 21st of May, 1471. It is likely that Henry's enemies kept him alive for so long due to the fact that they feared his son Edward more as a ruler. They would favour having the weaker Henry as the head of the Lancastrian forces. According to the history of the arrival of Edward IV, an official chronicle biased towards Edward, Henry died of pure displeasure and melancholy on hearing the news of the Battle of Tewkesbury and his son's death. However, the wider belief is much more sinister than a usurped king dying of a broken heart. It is believed that Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, who would later become the infamous Richard III, was at the Tower that evening, and could possibly even be responsible for the murder. It is believed that Henry was struck brutally whilst inside the Wakefield Tower, whilst praying in his private chapel. This account is disputed, with some records conflicting reports of the specific time of death, and also it's difficult to prove Gloucester's involvement. However, Thomas More's account of the history of Richard III does explicitly state that Richard killed Henry. Henry's body was then originally buried in Chertsey Abbey, and then in 1484 moved to St George's Chapel in Windsor by Richard III. Following Henry's death, a number of miracles were credited with the dead king, including him raising a plague victim from the dead as she was being stitched into a shroud. It's fair to say that this Lancastrian propaganda did not please the Yorkist Richard III. Henry VII, during his reign, began to build a chapel at Westminster Abbey to house the relics of Henry VI. In 1910, his body was found, and diggers found it to be 5 feet 9 inches tall. Rather disturbingly, light hair had been found that had been covered in blood, with severe damage to the skull. This evidence does indicate that Henry VI really did meet his end with a bloody act of violence. Henry VI was a king who was born into the throne, and born into a situation which could be interpreted as a poisoned chalice. Under his reign, he juggled the thrones of France and England, and eventually was plagued by the Civil War that raged between the two factions. His demise was almost certainly met with extreme brutality at the hands of a murderer who history has simply forgotten and to this day remains unknown. Thank you for watching. To support the channel, please subscribe. Once again, thanks for watching.